Okay, so in order to get started with all of this, what we need to do is we need to actually have an experiment that we're working with. So let's take a look at this basic experiment. Does the length of the string affect a pendulum swing? If we have the independent variable as the length of the string and the dependent variable is the amount of swings per 10 seconds, or what we're measuring, and then we have collected data that's listed right here that the 24 centimeter string swung 28 times and the 50 centimeter string swung 20 times. And we've done background research even before we got started that said exactly and related it back to a famous scientist's work, Galileo, that found that differences in length of the string is the only changing factor in pendulums, because a longer base will result in less swings, which actually totally relates back to what we found here. Now, knowing all of this and looking back to your own notebook pages and the research that you have done and the data you've collected, how can we go about writing a claim? Keeping in mind that we need to have both our independent variable and our dependent variable worked into our claim, how could we go about writing a strong claim? Well, we would need to say and relate it and think about what we've learned from our experiment by looking at our data. And our data said that the longer string has less swings. Well, our independent variable was the length of the string, and our dependent variable was the amount of swings. So does that sentence state a fact and also have in it those two things? You bet. So our claim could be that the longer the string, the slower the pendulum swings. Hopefully you can all see that right up in here. Now, I want you to take a look at another claim and tell me and think in your brain, and we'll talk about it in class, is this a good claim? So take a look at this claim here. I observed the shorter pendulum swing more than the longer pendulum. When we are thinking about our evidence section, we want to consider those things that were addressed in the video. We want to make sure that it supports the claim, that it's clear, and again, that it is a no opinion zone. So going back to our experiment about does the length of a string affect a pendulum swing, and we have our two variables and we have our data in here. This, in our evidence section, is where we want to focus on the data. How can we break this down and explain this without giving too much information? The biggest thing that we really want to realize here is that we do want to make sure that this is a writing portion. So we want to make sure that we have clear sentences. And even if it is data, we want to make sure that we include labels at the end of it to make sure that it is very clear. In this experiment, we were keeping track of the number of swings per 10 seconds. So we want to make sure that we have labeled what is a swing and what is actually the time. Now, I haven't given you overwhelming amounts of data here in our sample experiment, so we can actually take this and work with it pretty well. We want to make sure that we give enough data, not too much, but we want to make sure that we do present more than one piece of data. Okay, we want to make sure that we go more than one piece of data when we are explaining our evidence section. So let's go ahead and take a look at example, and we will discuss again in class, and I encourage you to do this in your summary section, whether or not this is a good evidence section. So here is our sample. The shorter string pendulum swung 28 times in 10 seconds, and the 50 centimeter string swung 20 times in 10 seconds. Take a second, reflect, think, is this a strong evidence section? And lastly, as we're working into the toughest section to write, the explanation section, that we want to make sure that we tie in the science behind your experiment and that it uses science as a link to the claim and the evidence. The biggest way that you can do that and show me that you understand the science behind it is to actually link into science vocabulary that you've studied, into perhaps science principles, perhaps linking also to specific scientists' work that have studied these topics that you have learned about. Now, our explanation section is going to tie in both our claim and our data that we have collected, but it also needs to go back to that initial first week that we did all of that research, and I encourage you to find so many sites to use for your bibliography. That is a big part of it, because in this section, okay, we can link back to a specific scientist's work who have found and has been proven true over and over again. Galileo, he did his research a long, long time ago, but people still are holding it to be true. And so we want to make sure that we reference Galileo in our explanation. So let's take a look at this explanation section. And I want you to review and think if this is a good explanation section and what qualities or characteristics are important in an explanation section. So we have here, from what I have learned in my experiment, I believe that the string length plays a big part in how a pendulum swings. It relates to Galileo's initial experiments, and I believe it as his research validates the data I collected in my experiment. As I have learned, the pendulum's oscillation, or back and forth motion, period, is affected by the plane of oscillation. There are many factors that impact this, like gravity, velocity, and distance. This is why, if you change the distance from the pendulum's pivot, or its hanging point, it will change how many swings it can make in a period. Please review this and think about qualities and characteristics of a good explanation section. I've given you little bits and pieces of conclusion. Now I want you to look at this, which is one whole conclusion put together, and evaluate its strengths and its weaknesses. You could follow the P&P pattern of positive, negative, positive as you do this evaluation. It's important to think that this is one conclusion all put together, and earlier in the video I have given you broken down by claim, evidence, and explanation. So what do you think? I have seen examples from 8th graders that look like this. Is this good? Could you do better? Think about it and reflect.